Good evening, one and all. Thank you for joining for the Bible study this week. I'm Lambda. I guess I'm representing Baptists, the UK flavour. With me this week, John Fisher. How are you doing?
And not too bad in yourself. And by the way, I'd like to say, as a Roman Catholic, it's kind of fun that both the Baptists and the Catholics were both oppressed by the Church of England. So it's kind of nice we have that in common.
Yeah, we're mostly here to beat up on the Church of England secretly. That's been my long-running aim. Lee Templar, how are you doing this evening?
Hello, fellow victims of the English Church.
Aren't the English terrible? That's the only allowable opinion these days.
Only allowable one.
And Northern Man, how are you doing?
I'm good. You all deserved it.
You're part of the English diaspora at this moment, I believe.
Yeah, at this point, basically.
More or less a traitor, the way I see it, to live overseas.
Yeah.
But that goes for anyone, a part of one of our prior colonies as well. So you're all in my bad books, really. Great. Let me pray, and then we'll get into looking at today's chapter, which we're going to be looking at Judges, a little bit of Samson's life. So let's pray. Lord God, I pray that today you'd be present in our discussions. I pray you'd be with us each individually as we meditate on your word, and corporately in our midst, even via these new weird methods of video calls and watching videos back and so on. But Lord, none of these technologies surprised you, and you continue to build your church. We praise you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Great. Let me share my screen. Let me share my ever-evolving Bible visualization software. I had an advert pop up once for one of those Bibles that has no verse numbers and no chapter headings and such, and it was like, this will transform your Bible reading. Your scriptural life will never be the same again. I think that's probably a bit exaggerated. The key thing about the Bible is it's God's communication with us, and every other little detail is a bit of a sideshow compared to the raw truths contained, I think. So here we go. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Actually, before we go any further, maybe it's worth giving a bit of a background here. I don't know if people know who the Philistines or the Philistines were. My understanding is that they originated from the kind of Aegean Sea region in Greece, migrated up and attacked Israel in about 1200 BC. And that didn't succeed. They ended up settling down nearby, and for hundreds of years, Israel and the Philistines were enemies, constantly at one another's throats. Is that accurate?
The Philistines took in Greek immigrants and mercenaries, but they themselves were pretty native to the region.
Okay.
They are the mother city of Carthage. Carthaginians come from Philistines. So fun little fact: if you were in Carthage during the Punic Wars, most people there would be able to communicate one-on-one with like biblical characters because they'd be speaking the same language, close to it. So think of what you may that the Punic Wars were against Semitic people, but it is they were pretty native to the region. The term Palestine comes directly from their name. The H got dropped.
Right, and one of their cities back in the day was Gaza, right?
Yes, famous to this day.
Indeed. And then the other ones, I think at this time, were Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. Some of those names also come up elsewhere in the Bible. So Samson kind of acts as a character who's one of the people in the nation of Israel at the time who pushes back against the Philistines as a bit of a deliverer, but for one reason or another, he's not entirely successful in his role. He's kind of so it's a slightly jingoistic story in some ways, but it's also a story of a character who's got significant moral flaws. It's an interesting story. Let's carry on. Let's see what happens. So Samson goes down to Timnah, and does anyone else want to say anything in kind of prep, in background and context for this before we get going? No.
Yeah.
Go on.
Just to speak to the general structure of the Book of Judges, it's one that heavily emphasizes the fact that Israel is going to fall short. God sends a particular judge, someone to warn Israel that they're falling short of the law, and then Israel rises up after heeding sometimes and then falls. So that's kind of the similar structure you're going to have with Samson. And Samson, like many of the other judges you're going to see in the book in total, is a very flawed individual. And that's actually emphasized what it says at the end of the book. And this was the time of the judges before there was the king and no one knew the law. So that's generally the structure you're going to get from the story, because of the fact that there was no king at the time ruling over Israel, as well as the fact that people were just ignorant of the law, which the book is trying to remind everyone who's reading it to stick fast to the law, or else you're going to visit and have the same issues that these characters that we're reading about face constantly.
And it's clearly quite a grim time to be alive. There's a lot of grisly, violent stuff that goes on in Judges, and it seems quite shocking and hopeless to modern eyes. But yet we see God is at work in what's going on. So yes, Samson goes down to Timnah, and in Timnah he sees one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his mother, "I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." What do we think about this as an approach for dating? You just spot somebody you like.
Still
Obviously,
superior to. I'll say this: it's still superior to Tinder.
That's like it's still a better love story than Twilight of dating approaches. Still a better way to find a wife than going on Tinder.
I just feel like Samson's a bit of an incel here, still living with his parents at like 40 or something.
Yeah. He's snapping his fingers and saying her, but he's saying it to his parents, which, I mean, significantly reduces his Chad points in my mind. He shouldn't be relying on his parents to sort out his love life. So yeah, strong incel vibes coming from Samson, as you say. But his father and mother said to him, "Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all your people that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" He's basically saying, can't you find a nice Jewish girl to settle down with?
One other thing to keep in mind is that some of the issues that a lot of earlier Bible commentators struggle with is here you have a protagonist who God's choosing, and yet he's someone who goes and wants a spouse who's unequally yoked, I believe is the expression, which is something that we as Christians deal with as well, but instead of someone from an opposite tribe, it's someone of a different faith and background. So one way of resolving this that the rabbis did, according to Leo Haydock, was that it's implied in the background in the tradition that, oh, she was just going to convert anyway, and this is what everyone would have understood. But I think as it shows later in the text, that's not true. She considers the Philistines to be her people, whereas if you look at someone like Ruth, who converted, she says, "Your people shall be my people." So that doesn't really work. But Haydock would actually say that in doing this, God wasn't willing it in the sense of, supporting it, but just permitting it, as he does a lot of times with some of his people, like with David choosing a harem of wives, despite the fact that, or Samson choosing harem of wives, despite the fact that God permits it, but he knows ultimately it's bad for him. So that's one of the issues that you kind of struggle with in the text itself.
You see this sort of thing happening all the time, don't you? Where people will date somebody who's not a Christian or a very recent convert, not showing a great deal of passion. And they'll tell you over and over, "Oh, don't worry, that I'll win them over in the end. Love is the top priority. I think this story is certainly one indication that this may not be a wise course to take your life in.
Yeah, I feel like God never directly condemns like things like polygamy or something like that, but he certainly gives a lot of examples of why it fails. And there is this element in the Bible where there are several topics in the Bible which are never spoken of, but are very clearly against what is being said. And polygamy is one of those things where it's like, or polygamy as well as like marrying outside of the faith is one of the things where like Christians had the liberty to do so, but it's not wise. And I don't know why God permits these things, as like things are like, I'm not going to condemn you for it, but you're accepting the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, even Paul says, as a matter of celibacy, that I would prefer if you would be like me, but rather than have you burn in the passions, it would be wiser if you were married and deal with your passions there. So, like a lot of times when God allows some people to falter into the passions and permits it, it's because he's trying to preserve something greater. So, for example, here we have, the fidel. Here, the ancient Jews would probably not have wanted just monogamy, so he tolerates that until the new covenant because he doesn't want Israel to falter any more than he knows they will, and they do that quite a bit in the Old Testament.
Oh, I lost my internet for a second there, but yes, I was agreeing with with everything I heard up until I dropped out. Great. Should we carry on? But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." So here's this girl who he hasn't spoken to, who's from a different tribe, but she's very good looking. Nothing wrong with being good looking, but sometimes you need some other traits as well. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord. So that throws a bit of a spanner in the works, doesn't it? So I know we've slightly touched on this already, but let's just lay it out fully. So it looks then like this was advised. Is that right? If it's from the Lord, then clearly this means that we should take this as a pattern for our lives, and we should also.
The flood was also from the Lord. not all things from the Lord are a blessing.
That is true.
Right.
Sometimes it's done as a punishment, and Haydock actually also says Scripture often says that he, being God, does and wills what he only permits, and he gives examples like in the book of Exodus and Joseph, where God speaks of hardening the hearts of people. So Pharaoh, for example, his heart was hardened, but God still disapproved of what he did, even though he, in a certain sense, willed that he would, in his permissive will, to will a certain end. In the case of Pharaoh, it was the Jews being held in captive into Egypt, and here we have Samson falling into lust with Delilah.
Apparently it's 30 F. That's Fahrenheit. I've got no idea what that means. 30 Fahrenheit. Sounds like balmy and warm. Good work, Lucius.
It's around zero. It's a little under 0 degrees Celsius.
I thought that might be the case. Right. So it was from the Lord, as in the Lord had wider plans. This particular pairing of Samson going after this girl played into God's. Well, it says for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. Am I right in reading that it's saying God was using this as a spark for the nation of Israel to hit back against the Philistines? Yeah. So not necessarily good for Samson, individually. I mean, I guess Judas betraying Jesus was part of God's plans. Not something that played out well for Judas individually in the end, nor something that God commended as an action of Judas, but certainly something that was from the Lord. Great, let's carry on. So at that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah, and behold, a young lion came towards him, roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion to pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. Now, let's be honest, like that is quite a Chad move, right? Destroying a lion.
What an absolute Chad.
Here's the thing. It's so Chad that even the other comparison is Chad. So, like, I couldn't tear apart a young goat. I'm not that powerful.
Right.
Like, and yet, not only could he tear a young goat, but he could actually do it with a lion too. I feel inadequate as a man now.
Yeah, it's like everyone's going, wow, he tore up a lion. And then everyone starts going, yeah, I can only tear up goats. And you have to sit there and go, yes, oh yeah, goats. That's about my limit as well, goats. When you're down of a weekend tearing up goats, you rest well the evening after that. I'm again not entirely sure, but I get the impression that when it says a young lion, that isn't implying like a little baby lion. This is like a lion who's coming into their prime. So we're talking about pretty crazy feat. I'd say miraculous. The Spirit of the Lord rushed on him in a similar way to how the Spirit of the Lord descended at Pentecost, and then the disciples were able to speak in multiple languages to the people around them. Yeah, it's a miraculous event.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
I'd agree.
Great. So yes, he this is kind of an aside, but we'll loop back to it later. So far this in the story, Samson is asked for this girl. He kills a lion, but he keeps quiet about it. He doesn't tell his mother and father, and that is also significant. Think about this like an Agatha Christie. You have to note all the little incidental events along the way. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. He takes another look, and she's still a good-looking gal. After some days, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion, and honey. He scraped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went.
Okay.
That's a fantastic mental image, isn't it?
Yeah, he doesn't even care about this bee stings. He just goes into the hive, yanks it out, and starts eating it. Like, it's kind of like Winnie the Pooh, but more badass.
He's like an actual bear.
Yeah.
Like, this guy would probably be quite a scary sight. I get the impression that he was probably quite intense to deal with. He isn't like a poet. He isn't dainty. He's ripping up lions and then eating honey out of their carcass.
I mean, to be fair, the bees kind of deserve it, taking up their home in the carcass of a lion. It's nature correcting it. Samson has to come along and instill the natural hierarchy again.
Am I right that when swarms of bees are on the hunt, they will literally pick just about anything to become their new temporary home? Like sometimes people will park a car at the wrong place in the wrong time, and it's the moment that the queen bee had decided, right, we're off, and suddenly the car, like the inside of the bonnet, has become the nesting ground for hundreds and hundreds of bees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, here's the thing. It's the desert is a very dry environment, assuming they are in the desert, and having a fresh carcass like right there, which is nice and humid on the inside, that would be like the ideal place to put in the beehive. So I think it's understandable why they picked it as their home.
But if you've got a lion's carcass lying there, you'd also expect other wild animals to be having at it too, I would think.
Yeah, I don't even think True, but like imagine that you're a vulture, you see bees like scouring around the carcass. You're not going to land there and start picking at it when you're bound to be stung.
I just associate the name Samson with lions. I almost instinctively want to call any lion I see Samson. Now that's just cruel because Samson is the most famous vanquisher of lions. It would be like calling an Englishman Braveheart or something. So he's there with his like honeycomb, and he came to his father and mother and gave some, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of a lion, although they might have guessed from the dripping red liquid that kind of encased it. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him, and Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you." What do you think the riddle is going to be? This bit reminded me when I was reading it earlier of, you know, that scene in The Hobbit where Gollum and Bilbo are trading riddles. And then do you know that? And then Bilbo's last riddle is like, "What's in my pocket?" It's just a ridiculous riddle. Should we say it?
I had the same thought where it seemed totally childish that he'd just come up on this indecipherable question of you wouldn't be able to guess the answer even if you could.
It's just like, how am I supposed to do that? Interesting point here from Will H. This is also Samson violating the covenant. The honey is unclean food. I didn't know that. Honey is unclean. Good. Glad you pointed that out. Also, his parents then, I guess, were violating the covenant. But yes, I don't think a lion has a cloven hoof or whatever it is. So eating a lion's probably okay, right?
I'm not sure if I have to see for sure because I know like John the Baptist and others were
also
expected
honey.
Yeah, they were expected to eat honey as part of their I don't know what I'd call it, like the standard that they're under.
Okay, well, hold that thought, Will. You're going to be fact checked. Could you, Luthampo, could you check that?
Debunk it, Luthor.
Well, we'll see. Somebody's going to be proven right. This fact has been disputed. Can we get like a little warning sign put up in chat?
Right. So I'm reading a Jewish source on this one, and basically it's saying this: honey consists of nectar, which bees gather, store, and transport to their honeycombs. While in the bee, the nectar is broken down and transformed into honey by enzymes in the bee, but it is not actually digested by the bee. So the bee is not a product of, so the honey is not a product of the bee itself, as is milk. 100% pure raw kosher honey.
Yeah.
Honey is kosher. When purchasing honey, be sure to check that it is kosher certified. Blah blah blah.
We'll clarify it. It's eating from the carcass. That is unclean.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, because anything to do with dead bodies made you like any dealing with dead things would make you unclean, right? So, and he also it raises the interesting question of if his parents would be made unclean also in turn, even though they weren't aware of it. I'm sure that many debates have been had over that question. But yes, all right, you've retreated from your initial controversial claim to a safer one, and now we can't attack you. All right, let's look at the riddle. So let me put a riddle to you.
No, I think we just misunderstood what you meant. I don't think.
No, I know. I'm just teasing, Will H. It's our fault, not yours. Let me put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within 7 days of the feast and find out the answer, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. 30 is quite a lot. I'm not sure I have 30 outfits. I don't know about you guys. Samson's sounding like a bit of a fancy lad to me. I just think we need to take down Samson as a sort of 3,000 year late character assassination.
Dude kills lions with his bare hands. I think he'd have no issue getting the pelts needed for all those clothes. Like what, 2 hunting trips and bam, he's done.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's fair. But then can he stitch? I've seen no evidence of his ability to he's totally skilled out on weaponry, and I don't think he's got the fine motor control necessary to. That's why he needs the wife, isn't it? Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Okay, so
he's after roles, are we?
That's what he saw in the Philistine. It's like fine darning fingers. So yeah, here we go. The contract has been drawn up, and they said to him, "Put your riddle that we may hear it." And he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." I enjoy that they made it rhyme in English. That always pleases me. It's not in all the translations, but I think this eat sweet rhyme is always makes me smile. So yeah, is this a fair riddle? Are there other solutions to this that would be equally valid, given that they didn't know that this event had happened?
Like, this would be a very hard riddle to know unless you personally saw the event take place. I even saw the event take place, and I couldn't even figure it out until Delilah revealed it later on in the chapter.
Right. I mean, out of the strong came something sweet. I mean, in English, we have this word sweet being used metaphorically all over the place, but as a literal thing, sweet flavors are quite hard to come by. Honey is one of the few natural things that is extremely high in sugar, right? I guess fruits as well.
According to my translation of scripture, it says, "Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness." Now, I'm not sure how it relates to the Hebrew itself, but like my translation, the Douay Rheims comes from the Vulgate, so the Latin actually makes it a little trickier too.
Even harder.
Yeah,
that's interesting. It's similar though, right? It's out of the eater came either meat or something to eat. Either way, seems clear to me. This is a predator becoming prey. So this is the old Qui-Gon Jinn line of "there's always a bigger fish."
I feel like I want to read into this something of the Eucharist as like a parallel to Christ. Like the Eucharist is out of the eater came something to eat. So Christ was of the flesh and he ate, and then we ate his flesh. Out of the strong came something sweet. Strong wine, but it's the sweet memory of salvation from the blood of Christ. I also think this is possibly mentioned elsewhere in the scriptures with the scroll that was eaten. It tasted like honey, but made a sour stomach.
It's actually quite nice that you mentioned that, because Leo Haydock, the Catholic commentator I'm reading, says something similar. He says, "Sweetness. The explication of the ancient riddle frequently depends on the knowledge of something that has taken place. Our riddle makers follow other rules. In a spiritual sense, the Philistines might be considered as those strong ones who had domineered over Israel, but would shortly afford them the spoils of a glorious victory. Jesus rises triumphant from the grave, and after he has been persecuted and torn in pieces, becomes the food for Christians." So yeah, that's. I think you are properly onto something there.
Yeah. So taking again a step backwards and saying how is this story reinterpreted in the light of Jesus, or how does it potentially point forwards is another way to view it. I guess if they'd have come up with that translation, they would have won like 60 garments or something. That's like that would have been a really impressive solution. That's the A* with flair triple backflip answer. If they'd also had some some foresight about the coming Messiah. Okay, so out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days, they could not solve the riddle. Not so surprising. On the fourth day, they're like really feasting for a long time here. They said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us?" The kind of light-hearted, fun chat that you might have at any social event, really. They're feasting, but they're not happy. And their solution to solve the riddle is to blackmail Samson's wife.
That's a nice home you had there. Would be a shame if it were to go up in flames because we couldn't get the answer to a riddle now, would it?
Yeah. And Samson's wife went over to him and said, "You only hate me. You do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is." Somebody mentioned earlier that she says here, "You've put a riddle to my people." So between her husband and these random blokes who are threatening her husband, she's still seeing herself as being on the side of the Philistines. I guess they're not random blokes. They're probably the people that she grew up with.
Yeah. It's another thing to keep in mind is this. Not only does it show that there is really no conversion experience behind all of this, it's also the fact that Samson is kind of being a douche. Like really, he didn't need to make the bet. I think in part, this is just his way of prodding a conflict as well. Like, you don't really put an unsolvable riddle unless you're really sure no one else is going to get the answer to this. And chances are he knows the kind of neighbors he's dealing with because the Philistines are, invading this territory and they have domination over everyone else there.
It would be like if I
that.
Go another man.
I was going to say that too, John, because I figured, like, if you imagine today that somebody made you a bet for 10 grand or something that you couldn't afford or would take a lot of time, and then they gave you a riddle that you just know that you wouldn't know the answer to, how angry you would get and how maybe irrational the output would be to try and solve the riddle and get out of the bet.
Yeah, no, especially if you're, the kind of person you're dealing with. Like, imagine if I had a wife and she had an uncle who was a member of the mafia, and he also had a bad gambling addiction. Like, this is not a person you want. This is not a person who's going to be a good sport about losing a lot of money.
I was going to say, does anyone want to take a bet right now? I don't know what I can offer.
How much, Lambda? You better have 30 sets of clothes for me.
I'll wager getting to choose the verse for next week on the Bible study.
What's your riddle then?
And I guess if I lose, then you get to pick it, and if I guess if I win, then I just get something that I already had. Okay, you hit the riddle. Over the wood, something bitter. Pieces of porcelain always glitter. There you go. Tell me, what is the solution for that?
I'm going to ask your wife, otherwise I'm going to burn down the whole city.
I'm not telling my wife. Partly because she's imaginary.
Folgers crystals.
Can I torture your waifu pillow long enough for you to tell me the answer?
I'm going to suggest Folgers crystals because they're bitter and yet they sparkle.
Nice. That's a good solution, but it's not the one I had in my mind. No, I was just imagining that. Anyone else want to have a guess?
No.
Okay, so it was kind of off the cuff. I was imagining that earlier in the week I had dropped a cup of coffee over some books, and it had been like a gold enameled coffee, so it had like made the paper, which is made of wood, taste bitter, and like bits of golden, cut pieces had gone everywhere. So nobody got it. That's because they didn't know that I dropped my coffee over a bunch of books earlier in the week. So no, Samson's skills do not extend above the neck. Fantastic insult. So now we can all imagine being in this situation. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is. And he said to her, "Behold, I have not told my father nor my mother. Shall I tell you?" Interesting when in-laws get compared to spouses. Again, probably not a wise comparison to make. She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. I'm going to say this party is not a success at this point. When there's threats of burning down houses and your wife is crying for 7 days, probably replan for next year.
Well, I'm from the Middle East, and I just have to ask, is there another sort of wedding feast?
Well, just a shorter one, I guess. It's the only alternative. The same elements. On the 7th day, he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people, and the men of the city said to him, on the 7th day before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" And I guess, what is more bitter than coffee? And what sparkles more than gold inlay? So I guess that's how you're supposed to answer the riddle.
I don't get why the answer to the riddle is a question.
It's just style points, isn't it?
I think maybe they're trying to show that they got it naturally rather than threatening his life for it. Like, well, really, what could be sweeter than honey? And of course,
right.
The line, of course, what could be stronger than that? These are obviously our answers here.
Yes, like it wasn't that we bribed your wife to tell us or blackmailed her to tell us. We just thought of all the sweet things we could, and honey won, and we thought of all the strong things we could, and lion won. So yeah, that's our answer. Also, we came across the carcass of a lion that was full of honey. And he said to them, "If you had not ploughed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." I just love the way these people talk.
Calling his wife a cow.
Yeah.
The old big girls, apparently.
That's better than like the old ball and chain, isn't it? The old heifer.
I didn't know she was a redhead.
Heifer doesn't necessarily mean redhead.
Really?
It's just a translation.
I thought like a heifer was a red cow. Never...
Yeah, in some places.
I see.
But rules are rules, right? They found the solution to the riddle by threatening his wife, but it wasn't a fair riddle. So what's he going to do? What's the polite answer in this case? The Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. So all kinds of mischief going on here. Technically, again, he had fulfilled his side of the garment, but he did so by murdering and stealing from their mates. This is like the Breaking Bad of Bible stories, isn't it?
Yeah, and to be fair, like maybe the power of the Spirit of the Lord here doesn't like come whenever God wills for it, but he naturally just endows this power to Samson, and Samson has the free will to do it whenever. Like the first time it was to destroy a lion, which at least is morally neutral. Now it's just like murdering people because of a gambling addiction.
It's kind of like the eating spinach for Popeye, isn't it? He a few times during his life, he has the Spirit of the Lord come on him, and he just goes berserk and like beats people up with whatever comes into his hands, causes absolute mayhem. But when you're being oppressed by a stronger people, you want that kind of turn the tables over, random, chaotic neutral character to be thrown into the mix, don't you? I'm just saying, tactically, when you're losing, you want Samson to exist because he's going to upset the apple cart. Yeah, so in hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to him as a companion who had been his best man. In their dens. Oh, hang on. Slightly lost track of this sentence. Have I got a mistake in the translation here, or have I just misread it? And Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man in their dens or lie in wait in their thicket. Can someone check the translation? This isn't making sense to me. Oh, I see what's happened here. Okay. Yes, the passage ends.
That was the end, right? That was the end.
The passage ends, and then I think it's last week's verses suddenly begin. I'm glad I didn't just blag it and try and pretend that I understood what was going on here.
Yeah.
So what's the actual end of the verse? It is Samson's.
It was his wife being given away.
So Samson's wife was given to his companion who had attended him, who had been with him at the feast. Okay, so what's up with this ending? Go on.
I was going to say, sounds like Samson got cucked.
Basically, yeah. What lesson should we draw from this?
Don't tell your wife's family a riddle, or they'll give her to your best friend.
Okay, that's a very specific answer. Maybe we can generalize a little bit, just a little.
Yeah.
Well, I always thought throughout this chapter, or at least throughout most of the Old Testament, like people like to make the claim that Christianity is some star-spangled view of the world and everyone's pure and there's goodness. And then the Bible's filled with such utterly despicable individuals who murder 30 people because he can't find clothes to make.
Yeah, and not only is the Bible full of these characters, these are often the characters who are on the quote-unquote good side. Like the people who represent Israel are the flawed individuals, which I think is a good reason, apart from anything else, to think that these are true stories, because if they'd been made up, they would have made them up like any other superhero story where you have very clear good characters and bad characters, and the guys on your side are morally wonderful individuals who also happen to be, usually quite violent and strong.
Yeah, I think there's only really like a couple of Bible characters that are like that, like with Elijah, and you get that with him. He's more or less considered to be perfect, as well as Jeremiah. But you really don't get that with too many others. Even Moses, who is like the #1 prophet for the Jews, even he murders a person at one point in the Bible.
Abraham tricks somebody that his wife is actually his sister because he's worried about them getting killed.
Actually, that's not so. He is deceitful, but in Hebrew there is actually no word for cousin. Instead, they actually use sister and brother as being an equivalent term. This is actually one of the reasons why, for example, you have Abraham calling his nephew Lot his brother. Sometimes, far off kin relationships are treated in an idiomatic way as being sibling relationships.
But nonetheless, he elided the truth in that he didn't point out that he was married to this woman, and then she ends up in the court of the pharaohs. But this happens actually more than once, and on both occasions, I think it's pretty clear in the narrative that Abraham was in the wrong.
Yeah, I think more. Yeah, my only point was it's not like a lie where we consider it to be a direct contradiction to the truth, but it is it's a way of speaking deceitfully. It's a little like if a Nazi was to come to your house and he says, "Are there any Jews in your house?" and you say, "I don't keep any undesirables here." Now, you don't really consider Jews to be undesirable, but you let the presumptions of the other person deceive them, and you essentially, without directly contradicting the truth, find a way to pull the wool over someone's eyes. But you are right. There is a lot of deceit going on with Pharaoh. But to be fair, Abraham was of the assumption that if Pharaoh knew he was married to Sarah, then he would have killed him.
But he knew that God had promised a descendant through Sarah. So he should have trusted God's promise. Anyway, the point is that lots of the people in the Old Testament who are held up later as great examples of faith are also flawed individuals, which tells us a lot about the way that Christians and I guess at this time Jews should have viewed their religion. It's not a religion of perfect people. It's a religion of broken people who God is being patient with, and the people who are considered blameless are not those who never sin. Like you mentioned, like Noah was considered blameless. Is that right in Hebrews 11? Not because he never did anything wrong, but because he was at least walking with God and trying to do better.
Yeah.
When I discussed sorry, you carry on, John.
I was also just going to add another point, is that it's also a pretty good warning of not being unequally yoked with someone who doesn't share your faith and background. Even though the woman here, Delilah, even though she was threatened by these people, she considered them to be at the same time her people, her fellow tribesmen, and there's always going to be that division that someone's going to have to deal with between the people you grew up with and have a background with and those who you marry. And that's why you do want someone who comes from your own background. And of course, here it's considered to be in more of a tribal setting, but for Christians, it's not just that, but also a spiritual one too. Although, to be fair, people who tend to come from the same background with similar experiences do tend to have much easier marriages, because there's more of a commonality there. But I digress.
I think that the absolute core of the message is that Samson was being greedy. He had absolutely no reason to start this bet in the first place, in this riddle. He just wanted to get himself some extra clothes, these extra garments. And what was the result of it? Well, at first it ruins the feasting. So they were at an otherwise pleasant event, although you get the impression that Samson was probably causing trouble wherever he went and being miserable. But theoretically, they could have been having a nice time. Instead, they're arguing because he tried to be smart. He tried to pull one over on people. He tried to extract value from the people he was around rather than living with them as loving relationships, which you can have with other normal people. And then he ends up losing his wife, who he clearly was very besotted with at the beginning of the chapter.
I'm gonna have to head out soon.
Oh yeah, you said that you had another engagement. Yeah. In fact, are you heading to another stream?
Yeah, yeah. I'll stick on till the end of the hour, the first hour. But great. I do want to offer an idea that Samson should really be read almost as an antithesis to Christ's life, in the same way that like Christ was extremely sacrificial and loving for his wife, the church. Samson's vengeful to get her no matter what. In the same way that like Samson has to do these trials and deeds from the Lord to basically prove the relationship. Christ did too, but unlike Christ, Samson fails these trials every time. He keeps failing to sins of various kinds. I think you can make a parallel between what Satan tempted Christ with what Samson's being tempted with like power over nations, immortality from your strength, from like things like that. Like when Satan was tempted, when Satan tempted Christ for like throwing himself off a ledge or something, and then like turning food from stones is something similar to finding food in the desert. There are some parallels. They're kind of weak in some areas, but I do find it interesting to like read it, because in the end, Samson, in some sense, sacrifices himself, but it's for a selfish reason and vengeful, not to save anyone.
Very good. I like that.
Yeah.
I wanted to briefly ask the question about, so we see that the original reason that he was interested in this girl, Delilah, is it Delilah? Yeah. No? Is that another story? No, this is a different girl. Is that right? He later gets in
I
a
don't
different.
remember if her name is mentioned.
No, he gets into a similar sort of situation with another lass in a later chapter called Delilah. In this case, it's just generic Philistine girl. And the reason that he was interested in her was because she was pleasing to the eye. And then later he kind of talks to her and he's like, yeah, so she's still pretty good looking. Is it a stretch to say there's something we should learn there about priorities in relationships and who we should be looking to marry?
Well, I think it was Socrates who said something along the lines of, you're either going to marry well and be happy, or you're going to marry badly and become a philosopher. So it's a win-win. Samson probably disproves this by not being a philosopher, but also having a very bad marriage. Although I will say this much, I think in terms of priorities, yeah, coming from a similar background is probably helpful. Not having dual divisions between your own personal family as well as the family that you marry into. That's a very helpful thing. When you do get married, make sure you can check some of your own points of pride, like needing to gamble, especially making ones with swallows of clothing. And I think those are just very important life lessons.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to do any vetting apart from visually. So it's not to say that you can't include physical attractiveness as one of your as one of the things that you're looking for, but it can't. A relationship is not only about what the person looks like, but they will also inevitably have a giant impact on your life in their actions and their power over you, as we see in this story.
Another contrast with Jesus, who looks at the heart, not the flesh, for his spouse in the church.
Will H says he doesn't just choose personally bad wives; he chooses actively subversive wives to him and his nation. Well, you do get kind of that impression in the chapter, don't you? That it's almost like he's kind of enjoying the fact that the girl he chose was upsetting to his parents. Reminds me a bit of a proverb that says that a wise son brings delight to his father. An unwise son brings sorrow to his mother. Like, we should probably expect our parents to both want the best for us and know more than us, them having been alive longer and have more wide context. So it's not to say your parents are necessarily correct in every instance.
Sorry.
You can complete that sentence in your own mind. Carry on, Cringe.
Oh no, I was just gonna say like that there is a substantially large amount of I guess the U.S. population who married just to piss off their parents, and time again it results in just it's a temporary high to get a one-up on your parents, and then you're miserable and usually end up in divorce.
Yeah, our whole society doesn't really get the idea of respecting elders, does it?
Yeah.
Although I would like to add, if this is all the case, then Samson is probably the first person who marries because he has daddy issues or parental issues. But
yes, indeed, the first recorded case, at least.
Yes,
it doesn't go well. He ends up burning in hot anger, killing a bunch of people, and losing his wife. And isn't that just, you read this chapter and then you look in the newsstands at the gossip magazines talking about celebrities' lives, and you think, has anything really changed? It's basically just people doing crazy impulsive things and making a mess of the world. But as we see in this case, God's plans for wider events in the world are going ahead, and sometimes he's even using directly the acts of sinful people to make those things happen. Right. Any last thoughts on the chapter?
I was just gonna say about the honor thy father and thy mother. The reason it's a commandment and a central trait of Christianity is just because we need to really stop believing that we're the first people to ever experience something, and in the human condition that possibly listening to your elders is a good idea. I mean, I've recently been reading the 4 Chinese classics, which are written around the 6th century BC, and they constantly go on about filial piety and listening to your parents as well. Because obviously, if you make the mistake, why not learn from the actions of your mother or the father instead of making exactly the same mistakes?
Yeah, and that's par for the course with like I've heard them whenever young people talk, not like super young, like 2 years younger even. I hear it. A lot of people always remark on like old things as, oh, that if it's old, it can't be good, or if it's old, it's out of date, it has to be replaced. You know, progress must go on. There's no concept that things can reach a ideal and then just stay there. I once knew I knew this like Syrian guy who had a lot of good Middle Eastern poetry, and he died like a year or two ago, but he had one of the best quotes I ever got from him is he who calls his fathers fools proves his lineage, which is just I love the craft of that quote. I use it so much for things like this. But like, if you're calling your dads all fools, then you're kind of proving that you are a fool like them.
Yeah, there's something that immediately reveals itself as shallow about the rebel without a cause, isn't there? At first, it looks like somebody bringing change into the world, you know, upsetting the system, showing what's wrong. And when they then are asked, what's your positive vision for the future? How do you think the world should be? It's revealed that they actually have no positive vision for the world. What they're railing against as issues are sorry, let me rephrase that. The fact that they can't put forwards a positive vision for the world shows that their criticism was shallow. It wasn't well thought through. They like the concept of a perfect world. It's almost like a vision that the world without sin could exist, that they're longing for, and yet their actions are actually pushing in the opposite direction because they're rebelling against any kind of authority.
Well, I feel like also that they don't have the utopian in mind. They just see where the current problems are, and it's easy to be the critic, but not easy to be the builder.
Yes.
It's easy to look at something and say, well, here are the problems, but you don't know where the effort went in to stop other problems as well.
Oh, they also don't know their history, and so they can't know what worked and what failed if they don't know what was tried before. By calling their parents fools, they're not bothering to investigate past attempts. And most of them would probably be very surprised to find how many of their utopian delusions were already tried by people they consider archaic. And it would probably change their perspective to find out that they were trying for the same ideals and that their ideas are not actually new and progressive, but rather ancient and rather old-fashioned. Like I said earlier in the stream, like if you lived in the year 100 AD, LGBTQ issues would be considered conservative and old-fashioned, and living in a dedicated relationship would be considered progressive and futuristic. Oh, what's this? You're dedicated? Well, no, you should have everything open to you, like, because hedonism was the standard for Rome. And emperors who came and went attempting to reform that to be more dedicated were considered progressive, and and the conservative senatorial class were like, no, we have to be able to have our manservants at any sexual pleasure we want.
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind is, and I think it actually speaks well to being an empiricist, is a lot of the traditions that have been handed down to us, we know from empirical experience that they work, or else they wouldn't have been passed down to through to a stabilized society. Whereas if you look at more progressive ideas, these far out ideas that try to divorce themselves from anything that came before, they're the thing that's abstract, and they're the thing that is only a hypothesis that people are willing to destroy an entire civilization to preserve or to bring into fruition. So this is why we also have to be very skeptical and trust what has been handed down to us, and make sure that the burden of proof is on the radical to showcase why this is all the problem, rather than try to prove that Western civilization or any civilization that has been handed down to us needs reform. Like, that's actually the amazing, miraculous thing about Christianity. Not only was it revolutionary in terms of progressing from what came before it, but in order to succeed, it literally had to be miraculous enough to hold together an entire civilization from the ground up. Otherwise, it wouldn't have done it so well. And there were times when it wasn't looking like it would do that. I mean, how many wars was the Roman Empire dragged into because it had to deal with Arians, for example? But fortunately, it did preserve, and it did show that it could be the basis for a civilization.
If you go on,
I just want to ask John Fisher, because this is something that I think about a lot. Is like, why did materialism inevitably lead to delusional mysticism of the progressive left today, whereas like the tradition, kind of like mythos-based beliefs of the medieval era, leads to more stable and rational family and societal structures that you see in say China or Russia, not necessarily free societies, but ones which are grounded in reality and what works.
That's a good question. So one of the things that has to be kept in mind is a lot of the left's philosophy is not actually materialistic. I would actually dispute that. Rather, if you look at ideas that they have, they actually think that the ideas are more foundational than the matter and the subject that they're studying. So, for example, when they say things like something is a social construct, like gender or some actual biological reality, they're putting the idea of the gender as being something that's abstract and saying we can change this as much as we want, and then the matter of reality is just going to flow from that. So, like, a lot of the stuff that we see from the progressive left today is actually much different than the classical Enlightenment liberalism that Christianity had to wrestle with during that era. And the reason why that leads to the progressivism we see today is because when you make man the measure of all things, of course, whatever ideas they have then become the measure of all things. And because that could be changed at whim, so too can the data be ignored. Whereas I think if you understand everything as coming from an immutable mind of a deity who does not change, who stays the same, then you're trying to seek the ideas through creation itself, and you're making something that is creation the objective measure of all things in your science. Whereas if you look at it the other way and you think that, oh, these are just tools and illustrations we use, then you're more likely to think, oh, well, I could change these ideas around, and I could therefore stop what I think to be the source of all the suppression that goes on. So I think I would put that as my analysis.
I can't be the first person to observe that there's something extremely Platonic about the progressive instinct, both from the idea that we should have enlightened rulers who understand more and run everything, to the concept that everything that we see in the world is struggling to attain to its purest form, that exists somewhere in an abstract way, that even human beings, their visual appearance that you see, it is sometimes misaligned with their actual true identity, and they should try to attain to it. They should try to modify the body to match to the reality that there is this abstract realism that is different from the dualism of it's somewhat different from the idea of a spiritual realm, which is kind of disconnected from physical reality. That there's a stronger link that the physical reality is the place where the utopia should spring from.
Yeah, like I feel like the benefit of Christians is that by putting utopia in heaven and something that God has to bring down, we keep it in a place that we can aim for, but not die to bring into reality, because we're aware we're not going to be able to until Christ brings it himself. That barrier that we build mentally allows us to stop being, well, if we want to, we can stop being Puritans that burn down societies to embrace something that's just not practically going to be real until Christ can manage it. And I find that's something Christianity is, that's probably the stable thing about Christianity, where no matter how progressive it can have in its values in some areas, we acknowledge that it's not practical to make it real until Jesus does it.
Mm-hmm.
On that note, I'm going to be heading out, but
thanks for joining this week.
I'll shill my little Substack and
go ahead.
You can post it later on luthknight.substack.com. I'm starting to write a lot of, like, I guess, rants against preconceived notions in Christianity in America. Just really getting tired of it. So I started writing as a form of mental release from just frustrations. Okay. Have a good one. Bye.
Yeah, cheers. See you next week. Maybe this is a good time to wrap up generally. John Fisher, would you like to share anything with our illustrious viewers?
All right. Well, if anyone likes my contribution or would like to see more of my personal work, I do have a channel which is in the description bar below. John Fisher 2.0 is the name, but my channel is known as the Original Win Productions. I have interviews. I am doing a new up-and-coming video series on the Second Vatican Council, as well as defending it as being a continuity of Catholic tradition. So feel free to subscribe if you'd be interested in that. And of course, I will have the odd video from time to time arguing against certain liberal ideas within society. So feel free to subscribe if that's your thing, as well as quite a few interviews.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Northern Man, would you like to plug anything?
Yeah, so after inadvertently ending up becoming the sayer of Chinese philosophy, pursuing the Chinese classics to show the inherent, what, if anything shows the triumph of God's works, it's the fact that the Chinese have exactly the same baseline ethical teachings in their four classics as are in the Bible. So that's what I'm trying to show through the four classics.
Interesting. I don't even know these four classics. Are these?
Well, they're quite so they're all by descendants of Kongzi, of Confucius, and they all tend to reference his work after his death. So they'll either be by a student of his or direct quotes from his disciples.
Interesting. Okay,
so would the analytics be one of them?
Yeah, the Analects is one, and then Mencius is another of the prestigious Mr. Moldbug stealing his name, and then the other one, the other one called Dashua, which means the Great Learning, and the final one is called the Doctrine of the Mean, like trying to find centrality in life. And they're really short. They're actually tiny. Like the Dashua and the Doctrine of the Medium are barely like 100 pages together.
And that's
the foundational doctrine
of Confucianism.
Well, not just the cortex of Confucianism, but like the cortex of successful Chinese society for 2,000 years. So
wow. Huh. There you
And
go.
I'd say that as much as I don't want to give Sargon any credit, he's definitely right with the regards to current China is just ancient China invaded by Western ideology.
Yeah, didn't the from what I recall, didn't a lot of the revolutionaries hate the Chinese classics that came before them and instead opted for, communistic European Western thinking?
Yeah, the Mao specifically taught not to read the traditional Chinese literature, that it was holding back the Chinese people, and that they could be liberated in new learnings from Karl Marx.
How did that work out for them?
It worked out really well, and 60 million people died. So,
Fantastic.
Yeah, nothing like looking at the longest continuously surviving civilization in all of human history and saying nothing to learn from anything that they've got to say.
This is a mistake, guys. Let's just copy the West. Like the Soviet Union's going so well. Let's do that, but worse. Okay? Let's do that. That's essentially the doctrines of Maoism.
Great. So, sub to John, do you want to John Fisher's YouTube channel? Do you want to say the name of that again?
Original Win Productions, like Original Sin, but when? Okay, yeah, Original Win Productions.
And sub to Northern Man, and join us again next week when we've got more Bible study to do. Thanks, everybody.